All right, welcome. Thanks for surviving the flood, first off, and being here with us today. As Jake mentioned, my name's Kyle. I lead the business team for Avail, and that means a lot of different things. But it's really fun being part of an ecosystem that's able to touch so many different ecosystems to help on like really critical infrastructure to help the space scale. I have the pleasure of being joined by Vaibhav Chellani, founder of Socket, and we're gonna dig into Socket, right? We're gonna dig into tech and your journey. But let's hear about you first. How'd you get into Web3? Why are you in Web3? And kind of what led you to this journey right now on what you're doing at Socket?
It's been a few pretty interesting last few years. So I've been involved since like 17, 18. Um, my first break in the space was actually by Anurag right there. I was one of the first hires at Polygon, and we were kind of based in Mumbai, and we were building things out. So we were working very closely together, building out Plasma. How do we scale Ethereum? All of those things, right? So it was a very exciting time. Bleeding edge research stuff, building it out, getting it to end users. We're building a lot, right? And kind of like in the super evolving thing, Plasma, which was super new. We were trying to kind of like build it out, see if it will be practical and whatnot. We decided to build like a Polygon POS chain to go alongside with it for people who really want like general purpose EVM and who want like cheap transactions and who want them done quickly and whatnot. So I think that's how I kind of like entered the space and kind of like started contributing throughout like get beat building bridges, building the Polygon POS chain, and that's how I kind of like started looking at the cross chain problem. But I think during that period at Polygon, while building Polygon POS, I wanted to kind of like figure out, okay, how do we make this thing more secure? Which is why I started looking into rollups, which was super new back in the day, like 2019. I built one of the first rollup implementations with some people at EF, and I was convinced, okay, this is how we'll scale Ethereum. This thing works. Next year, after Polygon went to mainnet, I spent a year at Ethereum Foundation working on, like, again, rollup stuff. How do we build this out? How do we make them super cheap? How do we compress call data so it's like cheap for the end users? So we are doing like BLS signatures and whatnot, which is when I realized, okay, to scale Ethereum, one rollup will not do it. We will likely have to kind of like have thousands of them, right? Because how rollups get scaling is by, yes, kind of like outsourcing compute, but also by sharding state, right? So to scale, we need to shard the state as much as possible, which means we are going to have a lot of rollups, right? And then it became super clear to me that, okay, we will probably need like a way to kind of like, comb these things back together, but maybe not in the same form as like having them all on the same chain. And that's when I started thinking about cross chain and stuff like that. But I think we can go into that in a bit.
Yeah. And on that early rollup experience, because it was early days when there weren't many rollups at all. It wasn't even a big thing in people's minds. You worked on Hubble, which was optimistic. Is that correct? And then you worked on early ZK rollups. Back then, what did that look like from the inside out? Was it clear that ZK would be a part of the future, or is it still a big unknown? Because back then we weren't even close to as far along, and I didn't think we'd get this far along this fast. Thanks to like the Polygon team and everyone else on Plonky and everything like that. But what was the early experience on the optimistic versus ZK side, and do those learnings still apply in what's going on right now?
Yeah, I think it was a very interesting experience, right? Like back then in the ZK world, there was nothing but like IDIN3 and Circom, who were kind of like DSLs that you can use to write ZK circuits and stuff like that. But they were still very kind of like, it was like you were playing with Legos. It wasn't really like a programming language. So it was like super hard to build like EVM inside a ZK circuit. You could do application specific stuff, but building an EVM inside a ZK circuit was like pretty hard, and like I could not do it for sure. Uh, on the contrary, writing Solidity for an optimistic rollup was still easier, right? So any day, if I have to build like I mean back then, if I had to build like an app specific rollup, I would choose an optimistic system because I can just write Solidity for it, and that would be the fraud proof. Versus if I had to write a ZK system, it would take some time to run. I don't know how secure it is and whatnot. I think things are changing super quick now. I think this is probably like a flip now.
Yeah, and I mean your experience with Plasma, like dozens, if not hundreds of iterations, just do POS, and then the optimistic ZK rollup stuff. I'm sure it informed a lot of what you're doing now and seeing that kind of roll-up centric future, not just in EVM but beyond. So let's talk about how that relates to what you're doing now, right? And I think most of us know that the cross-chain experience sucks, right? It's dangerous. It's one of the biggest attack vectors. But I mean, I'm across a lot of different protocols, a lot of different chains, and I love it. But it needs to get a lot better to be ready for someone that's not Web3 native. So let's talk about Socket's journey and evolution, because you've recently had a pivot, though it's kind of in the same realm. Like, give it some context on what you originally had in mind, even before putting rubber to the road, and then what you're tackling now after kind of the pivot to chain abstraction, and if that's a real pivot or if it's more of a mental framework, mental model that you're doing differently. I'd love to hear the evolution of Socket.
Yeah, that's a long story. So we started working on this like around like a year and a half, or maybe even 2 years ago. I don't fully remember. I think time kind of like moves quickly. But I think when we first started this out, we were like looking at the space in a very holistic fashion. What does this space need, right? It was very clear to us that the space does not need another bridge, and it was also very clear to us that bridges are not the same as like Dex is or like a swap application. Although a lot of people in the space think they are kind of like similar. Like you would hear these words together like swap and bridge, right? But it's not the case, right? Like whenever you are swapping, you care about one thing: what's the best price I can get. Whenever you are bridging, you need to care about like five different things. Okay, how secure is this thing? How much time is it going to take? What's the cost of doing this thing? Does it support the chain I want to go to? Does it support the token I want, right? So what that means is like a bridge can like differ from another bridge in like five different ways. So when we looked at the space holistically, we were seeing like people build like spreadsheets of like, okay, if you want to go from this chain to this chain, these are like 10 websites to visit. And this was like a world when we just had like 10 chains. Imagine like how that spreadsheet would look like today, right? It just wouldn't work. I think back then we were like, let's kind of like address this problem, but on a holistic sense. So instead of building a bridge, we decided to build this. I would call it an OFA now, but back then I would call it a bridge aggregator, where we were like, okay, let's kind of like have all of these things under the same hood and have like users and developers integrate this thing and have like the holistic experience where they guarantee to get the best price, best latency, best security, depending on the context, right? So if you're sending $10, you can still kind of like do it in like 1 minute. Versus if you're sending $1 million, you care a lot more about price and security, right? So this thing like really took off, right? Like today, like Coinbase uses Socket exclusively, MetaMask, Rainbow, Zapper, Xerion, Synthetics. We're the top 5 contract on most chains we are deployed on. And I think everyone probably in this room, if you are a heavy on-chain user, you have probably used Socket without knowing that it's being used underneath the hood, right? So this thing really took off, and we've been working on. After this, we are like, okay, asset bridging is cool. Looks like it's working. There are some fundamental constraints. People want to do more. People want to bridge and kind of like deposit into a protocol without having to kind of like have these things as two separate sections, where you bridge and then you think about, okay, how do I deposit, right? So we were building this messaging system. One of the first products we built on top of this messaging system was a roll-up bridge, which is now in production with like Avo, Lyra, Hook, and 6 different roll-ups. So think about it like a roll-up canonical bridge. And this is like also one of the alpha moments we had while building. A roll-up is not the same as the roll-up bridge. A roll-up and a roll-up bridge are two separate things, often kind of like paired together. But if you even if you separate them out, you can still have all the roll-up benefits, but have a lot more flexibility by being something like super independent, right? I can talk a little bit more about it, but probably not the right kind of context here. But this thing was pretty exciting as well. We rolled this out almost like 8 months ago in a super kind of like hush fashion. We never announced it, nothing. We were just working with the teams. Teams are going live with this, and it really did take off. We're securing around $500-600 million in TVL on this thing, and it's not even publicly announced yet, right? But as we kind of like started seeing this L2 boom happen, every day there's a new L2, there's a new L3. I just could not think of a drop down. Like imagine a bridging UI. Imagine a network selector dropdown with 150 different chains, right? That's the kind of like present now. It's not even the future. If you look at L2 Beat, there are like 11 L3 projects right now, and that's a very outdated list, to be honest. So for us, it was very clear that cross-chain is not the right mental model for the world we are in. Cross-chain is about connecting two chains. People no longer need like connection between chains. People need like something much higher bandwidth, right? Cross-chain is like dial-up, where okay, you have connection, right? But it sucks and you can't use it and it does not scale. So you need something much higher bandwidth, much more smarter, much kind of like higher level than like a cross-chain connection. I just call the cross-chain connection as laying out the fiber optics between two continents, and chain abstraction as taking that fiber optics and converting it into the internet, right?
And when you think of, and when you said like going to 150 chains, I started sweating because I understand that we're all going to have to do that, and I'm glad you're tackling that, some of us in this room are. When you're looking at the cross-chain experience, and it's a massive attack vector, right? Is everyone working on the same type of mechanisms, or are there a couple different frameworks that are guiding different paths? And I'd love to hear if they are different, what are they, whether it's optimistic or ZK, and then what are the pros and cons of each in your mind? And then we'll kind of get into a little bit more on socket.
Yeah, it's been super interesting actually. Like the space has evolved quite a bit. There are a lot of mechanisms that people use. So it's like it'll probably take me an hour or so to kind of like walk through all of them, but I'll kind of like quickly summarize them into three things, right? So there are things like messaging protocols, which are kind of like to send messages between two ecosystems, to chains and whatnot, right? Using this messaging protocol, you can build a token bridge on top, which allows people to mint and burn these assets, or you can use the same messaging system to allow users to swap between these two assets, right? What's the difference between like a burn and mint and like a cross-chain token bridge versus a cross-chain swapper? In a token bridge, like the supply between the chains of this token actually changes. So if you leave a chain and you kind of like go to another one, the supply of that token on the source chain will actually decrease, and the supply of that token on the destination will actually increase. So you can almost think about it like actually like value has moved between chains. But when you think about a cross-chain swap, it's kind of like, you know, you and I are on like two different sites and we do like a P2P settlement. So the total supply on both the chains kind of remain the same. Only the holders kind of like switch up. So broadly, I think these are the two kind of like broad categories. And because like we are built differently, you like this AMM model or this like swapping model operates more like an AMM versus this cross-chain model or this like token bridge model operates more like a burn and mint mechanism, which means it can be like really capital efficient, but it can also have like a pretty large like security surface area.
And I mean, you've been in this space for a while, and I think one thing that's pretty misunderstood, and that you're kind of pushing the envelope on it with regards to what it actually means. What's the difference between cross-chain and chain abstraction? Is cross-chain simply a subset of chain abstraction, and you're looking at tackling more verticals? So it'd be this, parent, and then a bunch of different little kids of different of the same flavor. So, like, what does that mean in the cross-chain versus chain abstraction umbrella?
Yeah, I think as I said, like cross-chain is about like how do you get two chains to agree on what happened on each other's end, right? So imagine there's a chain A, there's a chain B. How do you convince chain B something happened on chain A? That's the cross-chain problem, right? The chain abstraction problem is how do you get the user to see a combined balance of that user on both of these two chains and have the user kind of like spend it just like they would spend it if this balance was on a single chain, right? So I think chain abstraction operates at a much more higher level than cross-chain. It might use the same kind of like proving elements. So cross-chain systems use like different sort of like proving systems, ZK based, light line based, maybe like multisig based. so this chain abstraction thing might use like the same proving systems, and that's the only thing common between cross chain and chain abstraction. Cross chain is like a low level primitive. I don't think it's built for the future. We need like a higher order primitive for people to interact with, and that's the major difference between both of these things.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I think that gives us kind of a mental model to move forward into what Socket's doing. And I'd love to hear about the products or product that Socket's tackling and what that problem means. Is it just on the chain abstraction or what? Especially going into the modular order flow abstraction mechanism. Oh, I'm sorry, order flow auction mechanism, MOFA. So, like, talk to me what that is. Is that the main product? Is that flowing into other products? So, yeah, and I'd love for you to dive in deeply on that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think at Socket Labs, we primarily work on two things. One is a B2C interface that we run called Bungee Exchange, which is loved by a lot of people in the space. It guarantees you best execution between two chains. You can like swap and bridge and whatnot. And second is like socket infrastructure, right? So I think we are primarily focused on the infrastructure side, and Bungee is for us to kind of like showcase that to like actual users. We also work with a bunch of partners, around 250, 300 partners who also use the same socket infrastructure and expose what it can do to the end user. I think broadly, like you can think about what we've been doing so far as like a SaaS service, right? MoFa is converting that SaaS service into a protocol,
Nice.
right? So I think pretty much everything in crypto is a marketplace, and we were looking at this from the same lens, right? If Socket's a marketplace, it has two sides. It has a demand side, which is like users wanting to kind of like do things across different chains, and then there is a supply side, which is like actors trying to fulfill that and to make it happen, right? So far, Socket Labs was like kind of like the only solver, aggregating other kind of like on-chain avenues to like bridge across different layers. And now we'll, with this MoFa mechanism, we'll basically open it up. So you as a user, you can kind of like interact with these chains on a much more holistic level, because off-chain actors, not just Socket Labs, will be able to fulfill your demand for you, which allows us to scale to new chains. For example, I think maybe in like 4 to 6 weeks, we'll basically launch on 20 chains in like one day, and we'll do it again, and we'll do it again, and we'll do it again, right? Because now it's a protocol, so it helps us kind of like incentive align and expand much more quickly, right? You can now just launch an L3, fork socket, and go live, right? You don't have to come to the Socket Labs and kind of like ask them to add you and whatnot, right? So I think things like these, MoFa is kind of like it's a marketplace protocol that sits in the middle and regulates both parties. It makes sure users are happy. They get the best execution, best level security. It makes sure the system is incentive compatible so that off-chain actors like sequencers, market makers, solvers, searchers, fillers, they can kind of look at like what this user is trying to do and help them out fulfill this stuff on chain without having the users actually go on chain. So users in a cross chain model interact with like a source chain and a destination chain. In a chain abstraction model, users interact from a much more global level. They don't even know what chain they are on. They just sign authorizations and have these off-chain actors take care of it, and MoFa will make sure it's done in a secure fashion.
Yeah, and I always love where the inspiration comes from, and most importantly, what inspiration of where the mechanism comes from. Is Bungee and MoFa, are they novel mechanisms, or are they something that you thought was good based on like what certain VM or certain projects or protocols and marketplaces? You talked about marketplaces. So what was the shoulders of giants that you're kind of standing on, or is it something completely new and tackling it in a different way?
Yeah, I think pretty much nothing is completely new. It's always like 1 + 1 2. I've been thinking about OFAs for a while without knowing they were called OFAs. So pre Flashbots, I was trying to build something called Candy Shop. No one knows about it. Maybe if you search my name, you like find it. But it was like an OFA for swaps. I was going around talking to people that, hey, we should like build this thing out this way, but they were like, hey, Mev isn't a thing. What the fuck are you talking about? But then like I met the Flashbots people, and it became a thing. So I've been kind of like thinking about this stuff for a while, and I think OFAs have existed for a while, and they're a good kind of like system control mechanism. It's a good way to build a marketplace to incentive align both the supply and the demand sides, right? So I think MoFa is basically a marketplace that it's a mixture of like the OFA stuff I've been thinking about before. It's a mixture of the cross-chain stuff we've been working on over the last two years. It lies in the intersection of scaling, Mev world, and the cross-chain world.
And maybe one or two more questions. I don't want to run over time. What's the roadmap look like? What's the path forward? And you can never give engineering timelines; they're always fuzzy, and I'd shy away from it. But like, what does the future look like for Socket, near, mid, long term?
I think for us, we have the protocol sort of ready. And because we also run Mungie Exchange, which is our own B2C thing, we will kind of like push it there first, see how it works in practice. What does it solve for the end user? What's missing there? So you can expect MoFa to land on Mungie in the next like 4 to 6 weeks. And what that will enable is like Bungie.exchange. If you go on the website now, it clearly is a bridge. But once MoFa is enabled, you won't be selecting chains. You would just be like swapping through any chain, any asset pretty instantly. It'll go live on like L3s on day one. All the good stuff. I think that's what we are kind of like actively working on, building the infrastructure, shipping it to end users, getting feedback going, working with a few kind of like initial partners. We have this like public cohort running right now where we really encourage people to apply. If you are thinking about chain abstraction, we will work with you guys closely and kind of like make sure we deliver the chain abstraction dream together. So if you guys are thinking about it, please apply. We would love to work together.
Awesome. I hope we find ways to work together. It's fun when all the Lego pieces come together in the modular world. All right, so let's close out. Like, where can people go? Where should people go to learn about Socket and anything you're doing? Whether it's Twitter, I'd love for you to shout those out.
Yeah, I think socket.tech is the website, and Socket Protocol is the Twitter handle. You can DM me. You will probably find some of my tweets there. Just DM me or just DM the Socket Protocol handle, and we'll get in touch and take things from there.
Awesome. Appreciate it, man.
Thanks for
Appreciate
hosting.
the alpha.